Welcome to Annotations to Art, Politics and Life Itself. My name is Nico. My guest today is Stefan Kaegi. Stefan is a theater director and artist. He grew up in Switzerland, studied philosophy in Basel, art in Zurich, and theater in Gießen in Germany. He curates documentary theater, audio interventions, curated formats, and works in urban environments in a diverse variety of collaborative partnerships. Using research, public auditions, and conceptual processes, he often gives voice to experts who are not trained actors or performers, but have something to say. Most of Stefan's works are released via Remini Protokoll, the Berlin-based theatre collective he co-founded with Helgard Haug and Daniel Wetzel at the beginning of the millennium. Over the years, both Stefan and Remini Protokoll won numerous local, national, and international awards, and their work has been seen at festivals and theaters around the world. So I can see that Stefan has already arrived, so do let me invite him in. Stefan!
Hello, hi.
Thank you very much for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Yeah.
Where are you? Are you in Berlin or are you traveling?
No, I'm here in the Swiss mountains where I actually live.
Oh, excellent. And there's some snow in the background there.
Yes, it is.
Very nice. Stefan, let's get started straight away. I'm really excited to have you as my guest today. It's a great privilege. I'm a great supporter and fan of Remini Protokoll, as so many people are, I'm sure. But let me start with a very basic question, one you've probably been asked many times, or maybe asked yourself many times. Why do you make theater?
Yeah, it's a good question. I really hated theater when I grew up at some point. Well, I did a bit in college, but as soon as I started to be a more, I don't know, reflecting personality, I realized that a lot what was being done around the year 2000 in theater was basically illustrating literature, and this was really boring to me. I love literature, but I didn't understand why people would then put this in the space and become a slave of it. But in a way, I was always fascinated by this, this moment when everybody switches the mobile phone off and is together for 90 maybe minutes, 2 hours. So this was really something that I thought, why can't we use this togetherness in a different way? And so, yeah, I had studied visual arts a bit before, and I was kind of a bit unsatisfied with the way the consumers of visual arts and buyers of visual arts commercialize it, and even in museums kind of just pass by, and there's not this shared moment in time. And that's what I liked about theater, but I wanted it to have more content, to have more immersion maybe than this thing when you go into a theater and they switch off the lights in the audience room so that nobody sees the audience but just focuses on what's going on in the front. That's not the kind of theater we make.
Okay. Do you think theater has a sort of a fundamental societal or social, or may I dare say political sort of like role or place in society? I mean, when you go back to the Greek theater, it obviously was a very central, it was kind of part of the sort of the democratic sort of apparatus. And of course, today it's become a much more rarefied thing. If you go to the theater, what you see is kind of people my age with gray hair, sort of sitting in rows and kind of looking at, I don't know, a Goethe or Shakespeare or Schiller or whatever. But it had a more central societal role in previous times. And do you think there's something in that?
Well, I wouldn't say that there are only old people going to theater, at least not where I go to theater. This weekend, we were performing in Vienna, Volkstheater. We had quite, I mean, a cross-section of society, I'd say. There were really actually quite a lot of young people. In Berlin, it's hard to get tickets these days. It's really a lot of people want to go to theater, and it a bit varies from venue to venue, but I can see a lot of young people going to theater. The societal role, well, it's a big question. There were times when Lessing would say it has to be the moralische Anstalt, the place where we teach the I hate that phrase. He said like the unaufgeklärten, also this kind of the stupid crowd needs to be educated by theater, and I guess that's
an enlightenment idea, really,
yeah,
isn't it?
yeah. And yeah, so this is so wrong, and this is the kind of theater I really didn't feel at all reproducing ever, and that's what drove me away from theater first before I then turned back to it. No, I think it's really a place for a multi-sensual experience, and where you share time together at first, but then it's not arts. Well, the theater I like, obviously, there are lots of theater that are l'art pour l'art, and that are happy in being comedy or whatever, but what we with Rimini Protocol really like is to bring complex topics down to a physical experience that makes you reflect not only with your brain but with your entire body about topics like, you know, the United Nations climate conference, a very complicated situation. Why is which country not agreeing to lower the CO2 output? Why are certain countries just asking for money? How do these negotiations happen? And you can very quickly judge it. You read an article and you think, oh, okay, they're just, I don't know, they're just not moving on. But when you take 3 hours, as we did in a performance which we made with this topic, and you actually take over in our version a role of a country, Sudan or Canada. You don't choose, you're kind of thrown into one of these roles. And then you go through a number of experiences that actually open up your eyes to what it means to be in Sudan, and trying to somehow do something about the climate. Then it's a whole different story. I really think that we've built too many proscenium art theaters, too many theaters where you have this porticus where there is this, what we call in theater, the fourth wall, that's kind of separating the audience from what's going on there at the front. That's sometimes very useful for certain performances, but there's not enough spaces where we're actually kind of addressing the thing that we are all together in this, and the audience can also play a role, and we breathe together. That's the real experience. We hold our breath together, we may cry together, and that's something you can't do on internet in that sense.
That's very interesting. Now, going back to this, the UN conference idea that you did, which I believe was quite a successful sort of like event or performance idea. And was quite large scale too. I mean, I think for people who don't know Remini Protokol, I mean, some of the stuff you're doing is very, very ambitious. It's on a large scale often, and it really doesn't look like theater. It looks like something else, and people get sort of really sort of subsumed into it. They become very much part of the system that you're creating now. But what I kind of try to figure out here now is there's an element of simulation in this, you know. So you kind of, and or role playing simulation, that kind of thing. You know, where's the value added between that and just going to COP29 next year? Sorry, this year. I mean, in the autumn. I mean, in what way does the theater actually make that sort of an experience that sort of sits aside from the actual COP event that you could go to as well? Of course, you may not go as a representative of a country, but you still soak up an awful lot of the kind of the politics and the kind of the dynamics when you go there. What do you see the difference between the real thing and, if you like, your theatrical kind of performance of it?
Well, I'd love to go to the real COP as well. That's definitely also a good experience if you can get inside. Normally it's just for you know, ministers and their delegations, so you might not be allowed into. You might go to those lobby spaces that are a bit outside. I've been in Paris when it went in those spaces where a lot of NGOs are kind of, you know, making their activism use the place as a as a promotion place. No, you can totally go there, but it'll take you 3 weeks, the COP. So our evening, it's 4 hours. So maybe that's one advantage. But much more important, we do organize time and space in such a way that it is also, I'd say, entertaining. And I'm using this word that Adorno hates so much on purpose. I think entertainment can be something, but the question is, what is entertainment? And I believe a lot of Broadway musicals will not at all be entertaining to me. I think entertaining is something that keeps my thinking going while I am essentially nourished with other, that stays complex enough that I keep, that my synapses go blinking. So we do structure very precisely what's going on. It might sound, the concept might sound a little bit of the World Climate Conference we did, as if it was just a simulation, as you might do it in a university class, but it's not. It's actually the degree in which you participate is a physical one, but it's not. You don't have to improvise. You actually are constantly brought content by experts. So in this case, we do have people that had been to COPs, and we organize their contents, which might also, it gets very technical at some points what they would talk about, and we structure it in such a way that it is also talking to people that are not exactly experts in this field. So, and then we use the power of theater as well. We're not at all stepping back from that. So in the case of the World Climate Conference, there was, for example, a very big sun created out of 192 theater lights, a huge sun to kind of, was a very, very physical experience to be under it. And I guess it does have this aspect of a role play. You're right there, but it's not a carnival, so there is you're not a clown. You are the delegation of Saudi Arabia, and so you suddenly jump into a role of somebody whom you might be influenced by, or who might be maybe your ideological enemy even. But we live in a time where a lot of people don't want to listen to their enemies. In our staging, sometimes you can personify them, and you can identify, you can step into their shoes for a moment so that you understand, you see the world from their side, and this is really mind expanding, and you take something away from it.
It's interesting. I mean, there's sort of a question that's sort of and I don't want to, I don't want to labor it in any way, because I think it's a very interesting thing you're doing. So I'm not being super critical here, but it's just out of curiosity. I mean, if you take the kind of the COP process that they're kind of simulating, or that they're kind of enacting, through this performance. It's a political process. It's not a kind of a purely technocratic one, and it's a political process that very much, if you like, reproduces the kind of the hegemonic structure of capitalism. I mean, for the lack of a better word, the kind of extractive sort of like nature of capitalism, and also there's a lot of sort of criticism of the COP process in terms of that it doesn't move fast enough, and it's sort of seen as quite hypocritical when you look at the last one, which was, the president was at the same time the CEO of one of the largest oil-producing companies in the world. So there's all of that. So it's quite a thing to simulate without actually, in this day and age where people are so worried about climate change, it's quite a thing to simulate or to kind of to enact without actually taking a political position, or kind of trying to in some way make people understand something of a political nature by the end of the process. If you know what I'm trying to get to. So do you see yourself purely as a facilitator of a system, or do you have an agenda?
my first job was a journalist when I came out of school, and a bit of this still remains in me in two aspects. I still do a lot of research, actually much more than I could do as a journalist. As a journalist, you often have to act very fast without having that much time. Our projects often build up across 2 or 3 years. And also because we are trying, we're not making agitprop, we're not bringing across a message. I mean, funny enough, the performance, I was just touring to Vienna and then touring to Basel next week, is a performance that is called Dies ist keine Botschaft. In English, this is not an embassy, made in Taiwan. Now in German, it means dieses embassy is by chance the same word as message. Botschaft has this double meaning. So it literally in German, the performance is called, this is also called, this is not a message. So, and that stands in a way. So in this case, it's a performance with diplomats and NGO activists and musicians from Taiwan. And you may know they don't have the right to have their own embassies in any European countries other than Vatican State and all across the world. I think they only have 12 diplomatic allies because China is too strong, and China claims they belong kind of together and should be ruled by Beijing.
This is the one China policy, I believe they call it, yeah.
And so this brings about a lot of creativity in Taiwanese diplomacy, because they have to, they're not allowed to sing their anthem or hiss the flag in their representations that are not allowed to be called embassies, but they kind of then invent other names like technical office or Taipei representation, or I got inspired by their methods, and we thought, could we maybe use a theater that is protected by the freedom of the arts to install a Taiwanese embassy for the duration of a show. Obviously, theater does not construct something that stays behind, and we're not interested in, installing a post where you can apply for visas and stuff. But an embassy is more than that. It is somehow, and then we're coming back to the idea of message, it also is a place where you create a place to identify with a country. And Taiwan badly needs that, because in a case ever the attack that is somehow always in the air, but since decades in the air, ever happens, then they will hopefully get support from other countries. So to get, maybe they don't need so much the big national representation. Maybe they need the connection from people to people, and that is that show about. Now, you could say I have an agenda in helping them to have somehow an embassy, but then again, as soon as you start watching that show, you understand it's much more complex than this, because the three people that are on stage, they also belong to very different political groups. They actually were quite shocked in the beginning of the rehearsals discovering with whom they're in this show, and started protesting a lot about what the others would say, their vision about what the past of Taiwan is, what their flag should look like, what their anthem should sound like, and even what their embassy should be called like. Is it the Embassy of Taiwan or the Republic of China, which is somehow the old brought about title of the country. So it's this kind of complexity which I really enjoy, confronting people over the course of 90 minutes, which is much more than TV attention spans get to you when you do documentaries.
Absolutely, and you work with a kind of quite an unusual mix of people. You're not just working with sort of people coming from the theater, like say on the stage with actors and performers, but you also have experts, and you have got sort of non-professionals, just locals, people with maybe even with an agenda, like activists or whatever they might be, who have something to say, who would join that production in some kind of capacity. It's very interesting, and it of course it does something, because of course, you know, anybody who has kind of some training in performance or in theater will also have adopted certain rituals and certain mannerisms, certain ways of doing things. You know, you can see a trained person can spot it a mile off, and a non-trained person will, you know, will behave very differently in this space. And that in itself enriches, of course, greatly any kind of performative environment. So when you are bringing other people, when you're kind of thinking about the actual mix of people in a production, how do you go about this? I mean, because obviously you're not starting with a script where you have got different parts that you then have to cast for, but what you have a sort of a system and possibly a dynamic in mind. And, you know, and presumably that's where you're starting from. But what does this process actually look like for you?
It really depends on the format. We do pieces for museums. They have a totally different structure than we do pieces that are happening out in public spaces. For instance, we did a project where we work with 2 truck drivers, and it's very important that they're not actors actually, because they're actually driving a truck during the show, and the audience is sitting in the back of this truck. The truck is transformed in such a way that 50 people can sit where normally the goods are stocked, and a big window is installed on the side, on the left side, so the audience kind of feels like in a cinema that is moving. So they better be good drivers. And in the same moment, they have microphones, and they're talking about what it means to be driving across Europe in their everyday life, and how they sleep on the motorways and what borders mean to them. And so they really talk from an expertise that makes them kind of co-authors as well. So they're not just the performers, and they come with a very particular way of speaking, and that, you know, when they are out there on the road with the spectators coming along gas stations, getting stuck in traffic jams, they have a particular way of, an actor could never, you know, improvise along these forms. So we have to do long castings to find the right ones that, for instance, in this case, are have a ticket that allows them to drive, a license that allows them to drive a truck, but also a license that to transport people, which is a bus driver license. And they need to kind of be speaking a language that the audience understands. And when we were looking for truck drivers through a couple of announcements, then often, although it was said like for a theater project, obviously they thought they would be just the drivers and they would drive around the scenography. So it's also a very interesting process to make them understand, actually we're paying you, yes, and you'll be driving, yes, but we ask for more things. And so it's often it takes weeks and months to find the right people, because choosing the right people brings also a lot of the content, as we are often at times also really working with the biographies. In the Taiwanese project, there is a former diplomat. He has been to 7 countries, serving his country in different kind of roles and posts, and for 37 years. And so this has informed the way he speaks, the way he sings, the way he stands on stage. He is in a way an actor, you know, diplomats are obviously kind of actors, but yeah, the kind of actor of himself as a diplomat representing his country. And again, representation is so connected to theater. It was always the core business of theater.
I mean, when you're training as an artist, and indeed when you work with, I mean, I have sort of a bit of a background in the theatre myself, and I have worked in the past with amateurs, with non-professional actors, alongside professional actors as well, in a kind of a devised content. What I find one of the most challenging things I find, I mean, but this doesn't just go for people you bring into a production. This also goes if you go to uni to study art, you know, it's the same thing. You have to find your voice. And finding your voice is a kind of a process, isn't it? I mean, when you're working with sort of amateurs, there is this whole thing about sort of people serving up cliches and trying to kind of second guess what you might want to hear. And then, of course, some of their story they may consider too boring or too, everyday, and they may want to sort of jazz it up or somehow dramatize it. And so you, as a facilitator of that process, you have to walk a very thin line, a very fine line between sort of allowing them to kind of develop that and also kind of trying to bring them back to who you think, what you think the role is and how you think they should be expressing them. It's a very, very difficult thing to manage. How do you go about that? Do you actually rehearse with these people? And what does a rehearsal with, say, a truck driver look like?
Yeah, we do rehearse, but I think not as much as classical theater with actors would rehearse, because for us, a big part of the rehearsal really consists on the negotiation about the text, because they come with their stories. I find some of them extremely interesting and I want to tell them. And then I rewrite, I first interview them a lot, and then I start writing things down, and then I come back with a text and I suggest, why don't you try speaking this text? It's more or less what you said, but I organized it dramaturgically in a different way. And I would suggest that you show this picture while, and there will be this music playing, and could you walk from here to there or drink a tea while? And then they say, oh, wait, this I told you, I told this yesterday night, but I can never say it on stage. Okay, you can't. But yeah, what could you then say instead of it that has the same relevancy? And then we go, he goes correcting, or she goes correcting what I wrote, and then at some point I say, oh, but yeah, you want to tell this story of your life. For you, it's important, but for me, it might, in this context, not be relevant, because it's not just because these plays obviously are very much about these people, but in the same moment, they're not just about these people.
That's
they
right.
should
That's exactly my point.
Have a meaning for the audience. So it's not that they just improvise and say whatever they want. We negotiate a lot, very precisely, even about details in phrases. And in my Taiwanese project that we're touring now, this is not an embassy, it was really hard because diplomats are very good negotiators, and they come from very diplomatic, different political fields, different generations. So they also, among each other, were not at all agreeing that the other one says this without that she could contradict him, because she thinks it's totally wrong what he's saying. And then he says, so you have to find forms for it. And sometimes, so training the voice is not my big priority. If the voice is not so good, I'll use a microphone. And
no, I don't mean, when I say voice, sorry, you misunderstood me here. When I say voice, I don't mean the acoustic voice. I mean, yeah, the kind of who they are, who they want to represent on stage, what their message is. So say an artist, a painter, develops his or her voice through the style they develop in the painting. Yeah. A conductor develops his voice through a particular way of, kind of annotating, scores. So the voice is not really, I'm not talking about the actual instrument of speech. I'm talking about what they want to say. And this is exactly, I mean, you've already kind of answered that. And that's a very interesting. Now, what I want to kind of get to here now is because I find that and I don't think there's a right or wrong thing here, but this is whole thing about authenticity, and I think, and about also trust between that person, that truck driver and you, or between that ambassador or that kind of diplomat and you, and so forth. So the kind of, it's a very interesting relationship, because the story that you're developing through a dialogue, presumably, is a story that is in part probably just based on an actual thing that they experienced, and other parts of it might deviate from that experience to protect them, or because for other dramatic reasons, or because it needs to fit into the overall structure of of the production. How do you? What is your take on truth and in this context? How important is it that it's documentary, or how much creative license do you allow yourself in this process? And don't get me wrong, I'm not going to catch you out. I think it's entirely legit to be creative about this, but I think it's a very interesting question in this kind of post-truth era, where people kind of construct their stories and their biographies on Facebook and on Twitter, and as they please, and the kind of characters that emerge from that are partially grounded in real life, but they're partially also constructs of fantasy. And I think there's an element of that when you work in that kind of devised way with amateurs. It's very legit, but it's an interesting question of how you approach that and how you deal with that.
Yeah, authenticity is a complicated word. It was a word used a lot, when in the year 2000, Big Brother and all these reality TV shows started kicking off, and people started comparing them to what we were doing, and it's really not at all what we're doing, because they are busy trying to get their protagonists into situations where they're kind of doing mistakes and where they are caught with something they wouldn't actually want to say or something. That's not at all our goal. We work with these people who come from a particular background, and we want to make them strong to be able to represent themselves on the stage. But the authenticity is obviously in the fact that they are themselves. So if once the show is over, you can go and talk to them and ask questions, and you can go deeper into the story. People who know us and come to see our shows will actually come not because they want to admire somebody for how well he, shines on stage or how geniusly he moves in pirouettes. They come not to see what people can do. They come to see who people are and in what context they are combined, in what way, and dramaturgically organized around a topic. And sometimes actually, so is it always the truth that they tell about themselves? I might not double check everything that they're saying. It's certainly, I would say, it's the truth that they believe is their life. But some people even have very wrong memories about their childhood that they keep telling. Might happen, but normally that I guess that's exceptional. And in exceptional cases, we might even invent a fiction together with our protagonist. But mostly, I guess we're working in a similar way as a documentary filmmaker, that we really work along the lines, because the story of some of my protagonists, I couldn't even invent them from myself. I did just recently a project in Hamburg that is touring to Leipzig in some weeks. It's called Société Anonyme, and I invented it, and it's happening in total darkness. And the protagonists of it are staged without being seen, and this allowed me to find protagonists that for some reason have a story that they don't want, that they want to tell, but they don't want to tell it with their name and with their face being exposed. And a whole lot of topics came that have an authenticity in this particular format. They couldn't be authentic other than performed by actors, and this would be less authentic, I would say. So they have whistleblowers who would lose their job if you would stand on a stage. I have people that had suffered child abuse by their parents at some point, and they want to talk about it, but they don't want their families to be exposed. I have people who do illegal things or that have no papers, and so you kind of, through this technique of total darkness, which also comes with the whole ambisonic setup in the space, so it becomes very central as well. It allows us to also for ourselves, and this is very important, I think, to me always, what is the experience of the spectator, which is a weird word to, for somebody sitting in the darkness, but a user or visitor. Anyway, what he or she takes away from it, yeah.
It's. I mean, for me, there's sort of two different kind of layers. There's a kind of the kind of the layer of the individual performer, contributor, human being, and there all these kind of ethical issues are paramount. To protect them from whatever repercussions they might face because of what they're saying in that production. Of course, one strategy, and I think you probably use that quite well, is what I would call a kind of creative ambiguity. And by creative ambiguity, I mean, yes, it is true on the whole, but not every single detail. So don't quote us on it, because that's not the purpose of that story. The story serves a greater purpose. On the other hand, there is this kind of higher level, which is the kind of the collective level, the production level, of the thing as a whole. And their authenticity is paramount, absolutely paramount. So when you look at the production and you walk away and you think, well, that's kind of, it's just a story. It's just a kind of, it's just Mickey Mouse, Disneyland, then you failed. When you look at an individual performer, you may well wonder whether this is really what that lorry driver, what I mean? But it doesn't matter, because it feeds into a greater whole, and it's authentic at that collective level. And I think that's a kind of for me, that's a kind of a way of kind of dealing with that. I think, and I think, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but my sense is that you're doing that quite masterly as well. Because I think that's a kind of an important distinction. As for kind of reality TV versus reality theater, I do like this idea of reality theater, and I think there is a strong, but to say that the two are the same is totally wrong. I mean, there's so many differences between reality theater and reality TV. I mean, it starts with the fact that the audience in what you're doing has a very different place. They are not voyeurists. Yeah. They're not passive. They're not kind of waiting for somebody to be, beaten up, or for something, or to vote somebody out, or to kind of somehow, it's not bread and games. It's not a Roman kind of thing. No, they're part of it. They're kind of partners, if I understand you correctly, in what you're doing. So, but yeah, there is a reality element to it, and I think that gives it real power. I mean, if you think about, would you agree with that? I mean, do you sort of, because it's, of course, because we have reality TV as this real negative example of a kind of a reality production, we're kind of almost kind of barred from kind of going anywhere near reality work, because it's instantly compared to that. But I think it's important to kind of carve out that niche and say, no, theater is simply not the same as television, and it has very different rules.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, television is literally seeing something far away, and you can maybe see it through this little box, but theater is close vision, and it's much more. It's it's smell, it's sharing hormones, and it's in our performances often something that even gets you into action. We've been doing since almost 10 years now an audio tour about artificial intelligence that takes 50 people each in each show through a city, and there is no performer at all. There is a voice. It's the kind of voices that normally guides you with your navigator through the streets that you don't know. It's such a computer voice, but it is much more personalized. But the experience, and it guides you to places where you wouldn't normally get to. But mainly what is just as important is that you're together with 50 other people that are in the same moment listening to the same thing, and that every now and then for very specific reasons the voice tells you to I don't know, walk backwards, for instance, or sit in a particular way that becomes kind of sculptural in this public space. So you become actually a main performer or a body, a dancer, you could say, of a choreography that we've scripted in the same moment as you're listening to a complex sound score, binaural sounds mixing with music and the narration. But you are kind of part of the scenography for the others. And so you are, yeah, I mean, it's really being in the theater, and that actually it was very much the case. You talked about the Greek times. Theater back then was obviously something that was happening outdoors in a half-round situation where you could see each other, and people would scream and participate, be drunk on top, and so it was something much less educative, I would say, than the kind of Enlightenment theater that we talked earlier about.
Every artist I know, and I sort of kind of classify you as artist in that sense, every artist that I know on their own terms takes risks. But it means different things to different people. What does it mean for you in your practice to take a risk? What do you consider, like, where do you push the envelope when you do work? So I give an example, just a kind of one example where you might want to locate risk, but you can think of it in many different ways. I get the impression that although the audience is fully immersed and involved in the production, they are also contained within a fairly solid system. And so the audience doesn't really have potentially the possibility to break the system, or do they? In other words, how much freedom do you really afford that? And that's just one kind of way you could think in terms of risk in the work you do. You know, how much freedom do you afford the audience, and where do you kind of draw the line? Where do you feel that your dramatic concept, or your artistic concept would be somehow subverted or destroyed? I mean, but there's other ways in terms of thinking about risk, of course. But how do you, for yourself, think, oh, that would be risky, or what kind of, because risk has a certain attraction, doesn't it? But it means different things to every one of us. So what does risk mean to you in your practice?
It's really different from project to project. We have one touring project, which is, I think, going to Paris in some weeks. It's called The Conference of the Absent. And again, this is a performance that has no live performer touring with it. It is a whole setup in which, but this time indoors, this time on a frontal theater stage, the audience at some point is quite soon in the beginning, actually, the system is explained, and the system, which is a voice, basically explains to the audience, look, to save CO2, the protagonists, and for other reasons, did not come here, but we will instruct you how you can incorporate them, some of you. So who is voluntary to go on stage? And we were so much discussing before we did this show, what's the risk about what if nobody goes on stage? What if they go on stage, then they say their own things instead of, because what then happens is then, and my experience is, as we seduce people to trust us somehow, there is always somebody in the audience that will go. Sometimes it takes a bit longer, and then they go. And then they will be given texts, and lights will be programmed in such a way that it still creates a very theatrical performance. But in the center are these spectators who a minute ago wouldn't have known that they'll be on stage, and they are starting to impersonate somebody whom they discover who he or she is. They might be a Holocaust survivor, is one person, for instance, or they might be somebody who cannot move in real life and cannot be there for this. He's had this, what is called a locked-in syndrome, or they might be somebody from Yakutia too far away to travel to Paris. And the others watch them, this kind of becoming this person, although they clearly know it, they are not this person. And yeah, there were a lot of unpredictabilities that drove us crazy during the making of this process. What we then, I mean, we kind of embraced that risk. In the same moment, we kind of wanted a little bit to know what directions could this go. So what we often then do after the rehearsals is, or during the rehearsals, we do quite often tryouts. So where we invite test audiences and they play the system even if not fully developed yet. So yeah, things. Yeah, but I mean, obviously, for me as a spectator, I love when things go wrong in theater. It's normally the best moment,
Yeah,
because
totally.
because it's a moment where really everybody in the room understands this is unique, what we're going through. Some things have been scripted, and then if the mistake or the wronggoing, if everybody tries then to hide it and kind of, then it's a bit, become very awkward. But if we embrace the moment that things go wrong, then these moments can be wonderful.
No, absolutely, and of course, yeah, this is very true. I mean, in fact, if theater or indeed any art form becomes too programmatic and too predictable, it gets boring. I mean, it's even the case for any sort of narrative-based medium. You know, when the story becomes predictable, it gets boring. So, so absolutely, there is that. But are there risks, you know, that you have confronted in your work in the past, where you decided not to take it, where you kind of decided, well, no, we're not going to push it that far, we're going to keep it? Or other projects that you think, well, you know, this would be a really super risky project, but I'm not, you know, you can't really do it. Is there anything where you kind of like the holy grail of risk that you have in the back of your mind that that you may or may never kind of like really kind of tackle in terms of the kind of ambition that encapsulates your work? You know, how far would you push that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of projects that we did not make in that way. For instance, one project which we've discussed a lot with one particular producer was 100% Jerusalem, which, you know, 100% City is a project briefly describing where we try to depict where we invite 100 people on stage who exactly represent the demographics of a city. So they will have to say in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of neighborhood they live in terms of migration background, and of household size. So they're like a representative sample of their city, and then we ask them questions and they behave along with it. So you can kind of see your own city in a nutshell on stage, and it takes always a long while to find these people. And we've done this in, I don't know, 50 cities around the globe already. And it's always quite a impressive thing. Communities that never meet each other or would never talk to each other in the city come good. But in Jerusalem, it's just impossible to think that West and East Jerusalem would, I mean, to start with, where, on which side would the theater need to be? And then there will be just clearly, I don't know, some Orthodox Jews that would never stand on a stage together with, and there will be radical Muslims that would never stand on the stage together with the people from the other side. So yeah, so this has unfortunately never happened, and I don't think it will happen anytime soon in the context we are right now.
No, absolutely. And what's interesting in that example, because this is clearly obviously pushing the envelope to a point where it becomes potentially dangerous or counterproductive. I totally see that. Because it becomes literally unmanageable. And that's a really interesting idea. So when you're casting for a project, and you're casting, say, an expert or experts, would you have a sort of a governance role sometimes in mind for them as well? In other words, would they be just experts on a subject, like whatever it might be? or could they also be experts in facilitation or experts in a kind of in an area that would actually help the flow of the project or somehow keep it from derailing? Are you taking these kind of things into consideration?
Well, obviously, we have a lot of people working with us that are helping us to make it all happen, starting from the technicians that do stuff I would have no idea how to do them, the coders that and the producers are probably the ones that are the most, kind of anticipating certain risks and trying to stabilize things. The scenographers will work on how, the things we work with don't break and don't put anybody in danger. We don't normally really work with a psychologist. This could be another kind of facilitator or moderator.
I'm not talking about people on the outside, like a lighting designer or a production manager who might be concerned about safety on the set or whatever. I'm talking about participants in the production, like the lorry driver, but instead of driving a lorry, that person would have some kind of mediating function, but would be an expert in mediation. For example, a diplomat or whatever.
Well, diplomats we just had on stage, but not in the function of. We had kind of a bit MC-like characters in the past. For instance, in the World Climate Conference, there was, but he's a physicist actually, so he's not really a trained moderator, but he just turned out to be very good in this.
Would you yourself, as a director, participate in performances? Would you kind of go in and interact during, or would you stay out?
I'm never so far never on stage myself. My colleague, also from Remini Protokoll, Wetzel, he just made a performance about Amazon logistics centers inside a circus tent. And there and I think it is the first time that I know of that a Remini director went himself on stage. He actually became quite a central figure in it, but so maybe I will do it once myself. But I prefer really to look at things from outside. I see myself, our performances have kind of this form of experiments often, and they're really experiments made for the spectators, for the people who come to see it. So in order for me to anticipate or see how this could be enjoyed by the audience, I feel I need to be outside.
So, and last question on that subject, how do you define success? How would you say, wow, that worked? What is your criteria to make that assessment?
Well, there are many different forms of success. Obviously, there are some projects that just get a lot of invitations and they tour a lot, and so.
No, I don't mean at that level. I mean literally at the dynamics of the project itself. I mean, when I do a project, sometimes I think, yeah, it kind of was okay, or I think, wow, that's exactly what I wanted to achieve. Well, this really worked so well. Do you know that kind of thing where you kind of where you're happy with your work? That kind of way of defining success. How would you? What makes a good project for you?
Yeah, but for me, it really has to do with what happens when the audience is in. Because I try in my head to anticipate what I think should be the ingredients of this recipe. I try to create a recipe for something that will be then eaten in the end, and it really works when it kind of produces something within the people that eat it, or that become, as I said, sometimes also the center of it themselves, become food themselves. But again, for others. So when I think, okay, I really triggered something that then it's not that I don't do it for myself. I know that there are theater directors that basically say, well, I hate the audience. I just do it because I want to see it. I want to have done it. That's not the case for me.
Well, it would be difficult in your line of work anyway, wouldn't it? Because the audience is so heavily involved in the actual making of it that would be a difficult place. I did want to kind of talk about Brecht and his educational dialectics, but I don't think, given the conversation we've had, I think this would take us on a different track. And I also think I've got a fairly good idea now of the kind of, in what sense one might think of your theater as educational emancipatory. And I'm quite happy with that, just the way it kind of came out of the conversation. So the last thing, so I'm happy to drop that and not to go into that, because I think we're just opening another box. It probably would be a separate conversation altogether. But what I would like to do is do you have any? I mean, you guys, and not just you, but Remini Protocol, as a collective force, you really have inspired a whole generation of theater directors. And there's plenty of people who refer to your work as sort of standard bearers of a particular type of theater. Do you have any advice you would give any budding young theater director starting out now, how they should approach their craft? Should they do the same thing you guys are doing, or should they kind of branch out in another direction? What do you think?
Well, I hope that they're true to themselves to do really what they feel could be exciting. Huh? I must say, I started doing theater also very much because I hated a certain form of theater. It can be a good inspiration. I don't know if it's the right word, but a good trigger to do things. But what would be maybe one advice I'd like to give to the generation that is kicking off now, because I've talked to a lot of young artists and every now and then I do teachings in art schools, and I realized that in the last years, more and more, I had the feeling that there is a certain desire to stick together with people that are like-minded in their more and more I had the feeling people in art schools particularly, but I think it's a bigger phenomenon in the society at all. They like to stay in safe spaces where they'd like to exclude people that think differently. And I think if you want to be an artist, I think you need to think about the whole society. You shouldn't make art just for the peers of your self, but what you do, I mean, please do different stuff than we've done, hate what we've done and invent something totally different. I'm as a spectator also very happy when I see non-documentary work every now and then. Yeah, it shouldn't be the only form.
I think this is a really good place to finish. I think this comes really through in all of your work, but in yours in particular as well. This idea of making work that kind of goes beyond your own little bubble, that kind of tries to not only kind of reach across different sort of stratas of society, both vertically and horizontally, but also work that in a way unifies and brings together. So presumably there is kind of, I asked you earlier, is there an agenda? And if I was to kind of try to tease out one, I would say it's kind of to do with rediscovering some kind of sense of community and togetherness. And yeah, and in a way that to me is, of course, goes back to the kind of the theater as a meeting place, where different sides come together. And I think that's I think Remini does that really well, and you do this really well. And I hope that you can carry on doing this for a long time. I don't think you're going to get bored. I'm sure that won't happen. What is your just a quick sort of like what's your next big project?
Yeah, I'm right now rehearsing or working on a dance project for the first time in my life. So that's quite something, but it's not it's a big dance thing for the entire audience, actually, that is sitting in front of a huge mirror and sees themselves and the dancers seated in a classical setup and thinking about how the brain operates, because I believe the billions of synapses in our head have something in common with big crowds of people who don't think they're one subject altogether. I mean, might decentralize our way of thinking as well. And this is, I guess, the experience we're working on. So
and when is that coming out? Do you have a sort of a date for premiere already?
the opening is in August in Salzburger Festspiele. And the other thing that we're really busy doing in very different places is a project I developed with my partner Caroline Barneau. It's called Shared Landscapes, and it's an entire series actually of artistic works that happen throughout the whole day in what we call nature, so between trees and meadows. Next place where it happens is in Austria, and then it's happening in Milano and in Lisbon, and each time not in the city, but somewhere in the outskirts. And we have still a lot, even though the first versions of this project has already opened, but we have to adapt to work a lot on the recontextualization in each place. So that's also
excellent. And
exciting.
that is presumably that's touring, going around. And would members, if you would want to kind of catch that, would you have to go to more than one location? Would you have to kind of travel with you, or could you just go to one of those performances?
One of those performances, which takes an entire day. But yeah, then you will see 7 performances because we just curated it. There are actually a number of European artists involved whose work you would see out in nature, kind of performative land art, you could call it.
Excellent. And of course, presumably on Remini Protokoll.de, people will find a kind of a touring schedule and they'll find all the information.
Yes, they will.
Stefan, thank you very, very much. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. I hope I haven't been teasing or sort of like been too inquiring. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did.
I did. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will obviously keep a keen eye on your development going forward. And I wish you all the best of luck.
Thank you. All the best to you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.